Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Scott Knickelbine, the IT director here at Freedom From Religion Foundation. This week, as Donald Trump's second administration has just begun, we're taking a look at the relationship between race, faith, and fascism in America. Joining me remotely from a secure location in Washington, D.C. is Mark Dann, our governmental affairs director.
Hi, Scott. Good morning. Well, it's always eventful here in Washington, D.C., yesterday being very eventful. So it's good to talk with you today and all of our supporters as well.
And Mark, I know that you and the entire legal staff here at FFRF are frantically busy in the wake of the inauguration. So thank you for taking the time out to help me host this show.
Of course. I mean, I wouldn't say frantically. I would think it's more dedicated. And one thing, just a little bit of a commercial on all of us. We had our plans in place for that this could happen. It did happen. And we're pretty well prepared, whether it's legal, governmental affairs on the state level, federal level. I'm feeling pretty confident that we can meet this challenge head on. So I wouldn't say frantic, but I think we're working pretty hard and we're pretty confident on what we can do, where we're focusing, and where we can go.
As always, we want to hear your thoughts on the topics we discussed today. Please leave your questions in the chat below or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. We'll try our best to answer your questions live during the show. Joining us today is Robert P. Jones, founder and president of the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRRI. Welcome back to the show, Robert.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about the Trump inauguration. What did you see and hear yesterday, and what didn't you see and hear?
Well, I think most of what we were expecting, we saw. I think people were really surprised at, what became known as his American Carnage first inaugural address. And we got much, really more of the same, in this round of things. So I think, people or, well, let's wait and see. Trump will pivot toward the center. Maybe it won't be as bad as we think it's going to be. But, I think in this time, people knew exactly what they were getting. People knew exactly what they were voting for. Trump's never changed his tune, and we got it all in this speech. Everything from God saved him to make the country great again by saving him from an assassin's bullet. By the way, and not saving an innocent bystander's life from an assassin's bullet, right? But Trump sort of skips over that piece. So there was this kind of assertion of God's chosen prophet, right? God's chosen leader there. That's pretty standard fare from Trump on the campaign rally speech. But essentially, he brought his Christian nationalist campaign rally right into the halls of the Capitol Rotunda.
Mm-hmm. And you also saw I think we counted, there were 6 benedictions yesterday, and several of them kind of reaffirmed that idea that Trump is chosen by God, that God intervened to save him from an assassin's bullet, and of course, neglecting other people who were killed in that attack. So, yeah, I think it's pretty clear where they're going with a lot of this stuff.
I want to call out Franklin Graham right here, who is kind of Billy Graham's son, of course. And he had been a critic of Trump back in 2016, but, really drank the Kool-Aid. And even ahead of the election, had prayed, talking about how there was a spiritual element, dark forces arrayed against Trump, and had prayed, that God would put him back into the White House.
And recently you wrote in Religion Dispatches about Hegseth, who is the nominee for Secretary of Defense, and you pointed out that not a single senator probed the most dangerous part of Pete Hegseth's background, his ties with white Christian nationalism. What's going on in the Senate?
I was absolutely stunned by this. And on the one hand, of course, there is one of the best parts of our Constitution is the part that says there's no religious test for office, right? And that's hugely important for American identity. And I think one of the things we could be proud of, right? Is that separation of church and state, separation of religion from serving in office. So I think there was maybe some sense that that's what they were doing, but they completely abdicated their responsibility when there is a religious view that is antithetical to democracy, right? That's fair game. And particularly when he has written about it. And this was the stunning thing. 2 Republican senators brought it into the room. Like explicitly asked him to talk about his tattoos, and explicitly asked him about some of his being called a Christian Zionist, and so it was in the room, and it was equivalent like in a court hearing where the prosecutor like spends his time kind of telling one side of the story, and then the other side, when asked if they want to cross-examine, just says no, we're good. And just lets a one-sided story sit there. So just real quick, on his, he has these kind of Jerusalem crosses on his chest, a kind of big one and 4 in each quadrant of the first one. And he just says, oh yeah, they're just Christian symbols on his. But what he doesn't talk about is the one on his arm, and it's Latin phrase, Deus vult. It means God wills it, and it's directly above a sword. On his forearm, and an American flag with an M16 tattooed under the American flag. So you put all that together. That is a known white nationalist, white Christian nationalist phrase. It comes directly from the Crusades, and he's written positively about the Christian Crusades. It even talks about bringing a new crusade to America. This is the Department of Defense nominee, and no Democratic senator saw fit to maybe ask some questions about that.
Robert, I want to loop back to how we got here. This discussion stems from an article you wrote for Time magazine in November called "What White Christians Have Wrought." In that article you wrote, the most remarkable thing about this election is not which groups shifted marginally in Trump's direction, but which groups continued to provide him with supermajority support. Namely, we must talk about how thoroughly Christian nationalism has infected mainstream white Christianity. Robert, how do you think race, religion, and national myth combined to produce the second Trump presidency?
Well, thanks for that. That's the only post-election, post-mortem piece that I wrote, and it kind of intentionally so. People in my line of work in sociology, people who do public opinion, mostly what we get sort of paid to do is to kind of read the tea leaves and dissect the polls and look and see, okay, which groups move which direction this much, and all that's really important to understand what's going on, of course. But sometimes it does miss the forest for the trees. And in this election cycle, I thought, what's not so important is that, African Americans move 3 points or Latinos move 10 points here and there. Yes, for the big picture, that's important. But if we miss who stayed put in this election, and that was who were Donald Trump's most stalwart supporters every time he has been on the ballot. And it's been white Christians. And it's important to note that it's not just white evangelical Christians. They are, of course, his most stalwart supporters. Every time he's been on the ballot, approximately 8 in 10 white evangelical Christians have supported him. That's Franklin Graham and the like. But what's notable is that the other groups of white Christians, white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, that's the non-evangelical branch of white Christians, both have supported him about 6 in 10. So if you put all that together, all white Christians, about 2/3 of all white Christians in the country supported Trump and have done so every time he's been on the ballot. And then if you look at what a contrast that is with everyone else in the country. So if you look at Christians of color, for example, they're the exact opposite, mirror opposite. 2/3 supported Harris in this election. If you look at non-Christian religiously affiliated people, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, others, 2/3, right, supported not Trump, but Harris. If you look at the religiously unaffiliated, I know listeners of your program, very important there, it's 70% supported Harris over Trump. So it really is this one group of white Christians, evangelical, non-evangelical, and Catholic, who really, if we want to ask, why are we here? Why did Trump ever enter and come to power back in 2015, 2016. How was he able to incite an insurrection against the government and then come back and hold an inauguration in that same rotunda where people were carrying the Confederate flag through there? It's white Christians are the ones you have to lay the blame at the feet of.
So in the Time magazine piece, which you said, again, written 4 days after the election, PRRI has published a post-election survey, you touched on this, that focus on an even sharper light of the voting behavior of white Christians compared to Christians of color and other groups. Can you talk a little bit about, is there a drift of Christians of color into the Christian nationalist camp?
You know, it's interesting. When we measure just straight up Christian nationalist views, we do find that there are non-significant minorities of Christians of color who agree with many of those statements. And those statements are things like the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. Christians should exercise dominion over all parts of American society, as those kinds of questions. And so we find, a non-negligible minority who would agree with those statements in the abstract. But what's notable about it is when we look at Christians of color versus white Christians, and we ask, okay, even among those who hold those beliefs, what difference does it make in political space? It turns out that they don't go over and support Trump. Even like Christians of color who tend to believe those beliefs, it doesn't lead them to be overwhelmingly Republican. It doesn't lead them to be overwhelmingly supportive of Trump. So what is really the toxic cocktail is whiteness married up to Christian nationalism. And that really has always been the formula for anti-democratic, minority rule, and frankly, oligarchy in the country. We had an attempt at this. It was called the Confederacy, back over 150 years ago.
Right.
And that white Christian base really was the sort of the mainspring for the overall white structure of Trump's voters. 81%, according to CNN exit polls, were white. And of course, this was reflected across, as you mentioned, all Christian groups, really. Based on PRRI's research, what is Trump offering to white Americans that isn't so appealing to other groups?
Well, I think he's offering white supremacy, to be frank about it. And when you hear him talking about, which immigrants does he want, which immigrants does he not want, right? He's all good with Norway and Iceland and Greenland, right? But he's openly talked about shithole countries, and they're countries with majority black populations. So he's pretty overt about the kind of America that he wants to see. And he only makes promises about kind of bringing your religion back again when he's in front of white audiences. He doesn't go to black churches and talk about bringing your religion back, into the majority. It's really when he's in front of white audiences. And one other thing I'll say here is that there's a mythology out there that these are people who maybe they're kind of white Christians who are just Christian in name only. In other words, they claim the label, but they don't really go to church. But in every PRI survey we have ever done on this issue, the problem is actually inside of our churches in America. In other words, if you are a white evangelical Christian who goes to church more than once a week, you are much more likely to support Trump than if you identify as a white evangelical Christian who does not go to church at all. And not only that, but you're on board with even some of the most kind of egregious policies like mass deportation and setting up encampments. It's those who go to church or setting up deadly barbed wire at the southern border that we know leads to deaths. It is those church-going white evangelicals that are actually closer to Trump and more supportive of these violent and racist, frankly, policies than those who don't go to church.
So, Robert, when you spoke at the FFRF's National Convention 2023, you noted the organized Republican resistance to teaching race played a role in American history. And again, thank you so much for that great address, and folks can see that on our YouTube channel. So Tell us a little bit more about people, particularly white evangelical Christians, the hesitancy to talk about the United States' really disturbing past on race and racism. And tell us more about if talking about that or having truthful history lessons starts to freak people out. Can you talk a little bit about that, going from knowing the truth to, oh my goodness gracious, we're having these huge cataclysmic societal just meltdowns in somebody's head?
Yeah. Well, I should point out, I identify as Christian. So I'm saying all of this as someone who I'm white, identify as Christian. I grew up in the South as an evangelical. Mm-hmm. So these are all things that, are close to home are for me. But I think one of the things that's going on in order to understand what is just undoubtedly a backlash moment that we're in the middle of living through, a kind of white Christian backlash movement. So why are we seeing this today? And I think one of the clues is in how the country is changing. So it's really only been in the last 20 years that we have moved from being a majority white and Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country. So let me kind of just to show you how much has changed. Just in 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. So still comfortably majority white and Christian. By the time Trump enters the scene, that number had gone from 54 to 47, right? So we had crossed this line from being majority white and Christian to no longer majority white and Christian. Today, that number is 41. So the numbers of white Christians continue to drop. And now there might be you might think there's a little bit of a paradox here, and that, as these numbers are waning, it seems like they're having more and more influence. But what's happening is they're actually just getting more and more extreme as their numbers are waning. They're losing young people. The median age of these groups is going up as they get smaller. So they're getting smaller but grayer and more extreme here. But I think it's because they see the writing on the wall, right? And that in the past, like a word, for example, that we don't hear much about anymore, that we used to hear, as you know, is moral majority. Right. That was the term back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. And there was, a little bit of a kernel of truth in that there were majorities, white Christian groups, white Christians in the country. And so they were trying to play on that. You don't hear that term anymore because I think everybody knows the numbers just aren't there. And so part of what has happened is there can't just be an appeal to democratic processes, right, to wield influence, because the numbers aren't there. And that's why we're seeing support not only for things like voter suppression, but outright insurrection. Here that's now become whitewashed because it's extra democratic methods are the only way that these groups are going to hold power into the future as the country is changing all around them.
So in a way, Robert, we're sort of witnessing the death struggle of the white Christian majority.
Yeah, and it's a violent one. So I wrote about this first in a book I wrote in 2016 called "The End of White Christian America," where I wrote about this demographic decline, and then the last two books I've written have been about really marking the struggle of white Christians to come to terms with this history. But it is a challenging history to deal with, and I think particularly to realize, for white Christians, and I speak to white Christian groups all the time about like coming to terms. And one of the kind of mantras from Christianity in the New Testament is, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And the real challenge, I think, for white Christians is whether or not they want to be free. Do they want to be free of this racist past? Do they want to be free of what has really been a kind of anti-democratic movement in the country based on white supremacy? Do they want to be free of that past? And I think that's the real struggle before us.
So your research often touches on the growing diversity of the U.S. population that we've been talking about. And Trump, and moreover, his pretty sharp chief of staff, Susie Wiles, understands these changes in American life. It's not an accident that Susie Wiles is coming from Florida, where, about 25 years ago, when Bush v. Gore was coming through with that election, everyone was saying, don't worry, demographics are in our favor, and now you've seen Florida go from a purple state to a pretty strong red state. So is Trump and Wiles, are they building from the Florida model to grow their coalition? And if you were them, what would you be doing to grow the Trump coalition?
Oh my God. Well, look, it's first important to remember that, that they're sort of, this election was won, because of the peculiarities of our electoral college, right? So it was a legitimate win. There's no doubt about that. But it was exceedingly close, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's only about 300,000 votes in the kind of key swing states that kind of swung it this direction. Turnout was down, from previous elections. So he didn't get to 51%. All of that is true, right? But I think what they've been doing is kind of leveraging the opening that the Electoral College gives for a party that really does represent a minority of views to seize the levers of the presidency through the kind of mechanisms of the Electoral College. So I think that's really part of what's going on, and kind of just trying to build out. The Republican Party is quite astonishing. So I mentioned that in the U.S., the total population is only 41% white and Christian. But the Republican Party is made up of a group that is now 2/3 white and Christian. So they're really, it's clear what they're doing is they're building out this white Christian supermajority. It's a white Christian nationalist party with someone who is openly admiring and acting like a fascist leader at the head of it. So that's a really dangerous cocktail that sets out to really ensure by force minority rule in the country. I can't say I got much advice to give them. I mean, really, what they're out, but the winds are of change are pretty clear. I'm not one that thinks demographics are destiny. I think we're seeing the results of that failed philosophy right in front of us. It's entirely possible that we end up in a nation with fairly large majorities, somewhere different than the laws in this country are, because the levers of government have been taken over by a minority party that's really willing to undermine democracy to hang on to power.
Yeah, and the thing I've thought a lot about is that Trump has a choice. He can either be popular or he can go Project 2025, but he really can't do both. If you go hardcore Project 2025, you're going to be pretty unpopular.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the real weak spot is overplaying his hand. And so just a couple of things to remember. We don't actually live in a conservative country, even on some of the more controversial, what seem to be culture war controversial issues. So we'll just give you a couple here. Immigration. We've been asking questions about how do we deal with immigrants who are living in the country illegally for 15 years now. And we've asked the same question over time. And what we have seen after interviewing tens of thousands of Americans is that 6 in 10 of Americans say they want to see a path to citizenship available for immigrants who are living in the country. Even when we say they're living in the country illegally, yes, that's who they are. What would you rather deport them, allow them to have some kind of something short of citizenship, or have citizenship? It is 6 in 10 who say they want to see. It's 3 times as many who say they want to see a path to citizenship as say they want to see them deported. On LGBTQ rights, it is now more than 6 in 10. It's nearly 2/3 who say gay and lesbian couples should be allowed to marry. On abortion, it is more than 6 in 10 who say they support the legality of abortion. And this includes even groups like Catholics, right? We see 6 in 10 Catholics who support abortion rights. So on all these issues, right, we're really not this right-wing country, right? We are really more like a center-left country, more like a 2/3, 1/3 country on many of these issues that are even seen to be divisive. And yet we've got Trump. And so I think that's the real vulnerability for Trump, is overplaying his hand on these issues that does create not just a partisan backlash, but a much broader kind of reaction against these extreme policies.
Right. And Robert, help me understand this. When we talk a lot of times with our religious counterparts and who we work in coalition with, and a lot of times, a lot of religious groups, whether they're Baptists and whatnot, immigration's actually, in what you said, a fair path to citizenship has actually been kind of a cornerstone of what a lot of religious allies work on. So if you have that, and understanding that, or hunger issues. Hunger issues are usually very big with our religious, even more center-right religious counterparts. How does that happen? And then the next step is mass deportation. That's the whole thing I don't quite understand about all this stuff.
Well, I think we'll see. I mean, I do think when we start seeing it on the ground, and I'm hoping there will be some bright lines, that will show up. So we have been down this path before. So if the last time the Enemy Aliens, Act was invoked, right? It was invoked to set up encampments to target people of Japanese, Italian, and German ancestry in the midst of World War II. Ended up affecting over 100,000, particularly Japanese Americans, right, that lost their jobs, their homes, their livelihood, all of that, and some of that lasted for years with Japanese people. At the time, it was in the middle of a war. It was actually fairly popular, but it came very quickly to be seen as one of the biggest stains on American democracy in our history. And, I'm hoping that having come to that conclusion, when we start seeing militarized encampments set up on U.S. soil, this will trigger things. And frankly, when we start seeing, the person who's sitting in the Oval Office quoting Mein Kampf, right, and talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of the country, which we are sure to hear more of. When we see one of his favorite sycophants doing a Nazi salute, like these things, I think I hope have some traction, right? And actually people go, wait a minute, like I may be conservative, but I'm not for, my father, my grandparents, they fought against the Nazis. Like that's not us.
Robert, how does the current entanglement of white Christianity and Christian nationalism compare to historical intersections of religion and politics in the U.S., such as during the Civil Rights Movement or you had mentioned earlier, the moral majority era?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I mean, going back to the title of this, the essay that I wrote, White Christians Have Wrought, and again, I'm someone who comes from inside that community, but it is absolutely true that if, just pick your point, if before the Civil War, enough white Christians had gotten on the side of justice and abolition and equality, we could have avoided the Civil War. The Confederate leaders, actually, the white Christian Confederate leaders, just bathed the Confederacy in Christianity. In fact, the Confederate Constitution, unlike the U.S. Constitution, has references to God in it. If we go to Reconstruction, if we go to lynching, if we go to Jim Crow, segregation, all of these things, it is true that if the white Christian majority, enough of them had said no to those things, we could have had a different path in our history here. So there's always been, I think, this problem with white Christians committed to holding on to power in disproportionate ways that we still haven't come to terms with. And I think that's one of the big resistances to getting a truer version of history. It's going to mean that white Christians have to confront that past, right? But I think if we can do that, it's the only way to really get us to a healthier history. But again, we don't have when we ask these questions here, we have, for example, on adherence to Christian nationalism in the country, it's only about a third of the country that affirms those Christian nationalist views. It means 2/3 of the country rejects it. But white evangelicals, it's 2/3 of them that affirm it. Among Republicans, it's a majority of Republicans that affirm it, right? And now have the levers to power. So, but I think the thing is, enough white Christians are going to have to stand up and say and be counted and say, yeah, no, this is not us. This is actually not the best of our faith, and it's certainly not the best of our country.
So, Robert, From your own example or life in the Christian conservative evangelical community, can you tell us a time of about someone you know who may have had these views about Christian nationalism or racist views on Christian nationalism and came over to seeing things in a more clear way? Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it took and what were those conversations like, just even on a personal level?
Yeah, well, I could start, pretty personally here. You're talking to one of them. I grew up very much in the middle of I grew up as a Southern Baptist. I went to a Southern Baptist college. I went to a Southern Baptist seminary. I was that kid who was at church 5 days a week. I went to a public high school that was really bathed in white supremacy. We were the rebels. We flew Confederate flags at the football game. I had a Confederate flag on the front of my truck as a high school student. And it's been a long path out of that world. And so, I think it took relationships with people of color. I think it took, actually, for me, it took going to seminary and realizing that and having a professor that told me the truth. We've been talking about truth here, but having a professor that told me the truth, and that is that the denomination that I grew up in, the Southern Baptist Convention, that its genesis story was that it was founded to be a place where enslaving others based on the color of their skin could be compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's its origin story in 1845. And so coming clear of that, someone else that comes to mind is a friend of mine named Brad Onishi. He's co-host of this podcast called Straight White American Jesus, but he's also written a kind of a memoirish book called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. And he has a very similar story to mine, having, kind of grown up very much in that world and kind of finding his way out.
So a lot of it came during college. And is that why you're starting to see some of these policies from the Trump administration starting to come down pretty hard on colleges and universities?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that this movement has always done is tried to, be as insular as possible. So you have the homeschooling movement to kind of pull kids out of public school, right, and give them kind of either Christian education at a Christian academy. And by the way, let's go by without saying this, in the South in particular, if you see the words Christian academy, you could pretty much bet that it was founded as a segregation academy, right? So the kind of white supremacy and these Christian academies go hand in hand together. They were almost all founded in the wake of Brown v. Board of education in the South. So there's that kind of insularity. And college typically opens people up, right? So they get to know people who they typically haven't been around from different areas of the country, people of different racial and religious backgrounds. And it is a kind of experience of pluralism that I think in many ways attacking those systems and attacking the ability of those institutions to teach that kind of broader history of the country is also kind of part of the agenda.
Robert, how do you think the increasing diversity of religious beliefs, the rise of the religiously unaffiliated, and continuing demographic change in America will affect the future of white political Christian influence? Is white supremacy going down without a fight?
Well, clearly it's not. I mean, I think the thing we're going to see, particularly over the next 4 years, maybe one way of understanding these 4 years, let's just be clear. We don't get Trump without Obama, without our first African-American president. And it's no coincidence to me that it is during our first African-American president's tenure that the country shifts from being majority white Christian to no longer being majority white Christian. So we have this backlash moment to this very visible symbol of racial diversity in the White House and this demographic change at the same time. I think one way of thinking about these next 4 years is to think about this as white Christian nationalism's last stand. And Trump very much talks about it that way. He all the time uses apocalyptic languages where he says, look, if you don't elect me, you're never going to see a candidate like me, and we're not going to have a country anymore. And it's very clear what he means by that, and that he's going to do everything he can to turn back the clock. And, he can't do anything about the demographics of the country, but he can try to turn back the legal structures in the country to kind of favor one particular group over really the growing majority in the country.
Well, Robert, we have some questions from our audience, and one is, do you think that this issue of the impact of white Christian nationalism gets talked about enough in the media and on the news media?
Well, I mean, yes and no. So on the one hand, I think the fact that we have a term that is being used by the media, Christian nationalism, if you Google that term, you will see lots of media coverage over. And so that's actually important, and that's actually fairly new. And I'll kind of credit my sociological, colleagues for really establishing this term and doing the research that not only kind of establishes as a term to be used, but one that is grounded actually in very concrete research and has a kind of factual basis to it. So I think that's actually really important here that we have that, and it's a useful term. It's a term with a definition, and it's database definition. We can measure it over time and going forward. So I think that's hugely important to us, in this current moment.
And the next question is, the audience wants to know, what can we do to help fight back against Christian nationalism?
Well, I think, continue to call it out for what it is. And Christian nationalism is anti-democratic. It is almost, usually when I use the term, it's white Christian nationalism. It is an ethno-religious movement, and that's really important as well. It's not just theological. It's an ethno-religious movement. It's always been that way in the U.S. And so to continue to identify it that way, because I think there's a way in which if you don't identify it that way, sometimes they sort of hide behind kind of a theological view. But it's a movement of ethno-religious dominance, right, of kind of white Christian dominance in the country. There couldn't be anything more antithetical to a pluralistic democracy than that.
So we should remember to leave the white in front of white Christian nationalism.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Well, and the other thing that you can do out there in the audience is join the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We're working around the clock to help confront and identify the sources of white Christian nationalism in our government and at all levels of government, from the White House right down to the school board. Robert, thank you for coming on our show this week. Can you tell our viewers the best way that they can follow the work you do at PRRI?
Well, thank you for that. So yes, we will continue to track the threat of white Christian nationalism over these next years. You can follow our work at prri.org. And I'd also love to invite everyone over to my Substack newsletter, where every week I am writing kind of my own take on the news, on the threats of white Christian nationalism. That is at www.whitetolong.net.
And I subscribe to that Substack, and it is very excellent. That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. A new episode of our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, airs this weekend. FFRF co-presidents Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker will speak with the atheist singer-songwriter Shelley Segal.
Say that I need to be saved. Say with me, the devil's got his way. I want to know how when you are praying, when you are doomsdaying, how you think you know that someone is listening to what you are saying. So you think that you can tell us how to live our lives, never questioning the source from which your moral core derives. You think that suffering is part of some great plan that's been devised. I wonder when we'll be rid of your lies.
You'll be able to watch that episode on TV stations around the country this weekend. and soon on the FFRF YouTube channel.
And don't miss our weekly radio show, Free Thought Radio. You can find Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts, or check with us online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.